My 22-year-old son, Jimmy, still lived at home. He worked on his computer all day doing some kind of IT job that I couldn't understand. That was all well and good, but I was worried that he spent too much time online. He never went out. I could hear him talking to people in his room, but it was always through his little microphone. I can't even remember the last time I met one of his friends in real life. Still, he made good money, and I knew that he loved what he did. His father and I mostly left him alone. Most days, we'd only see him when he came downstairs for lunch or dinner. We tried to encourage him to go outside and try to meet people, but he always told us that he was happy. Then, one day, a huge box arrived on our front porch. It was the size of a refrigerator, and it was addressed to Jimmy. I went up to his room and told him that his package had arrived. He screamed at me through his door. "You didn't open it, did you?" He sounded really panicked. Of course not," I said. "Good." And then he went downstairs, and the two of us carried the box into his room. I tried to ask him what it was, but he just said that it was something he'd ordered. I had a really strange feeling about it, but I didn't want him to get mad. Over the next few days, more packages arrived. They were all of different sizes, all addressed to Jimmy. Each one was pretty heavy, so I always helped him carry them up to his room. I knew he wouldn't tell me what they were, so I tried to ask him other questions. I wanted to get any information I could. I asked him if he'd ordered from Amazon, but he said no. He said that he was using a marketplace on the dark web. I had no idea what the dark web was, but it didn't sound good. It sounded illegal. After the 5th or 6th box arrived, Jimmy said that he'd gotten everything he needed. After that, he just stayed up in his room. He didn't even come down to eat dinner with us anymore. In the night, I could hear him go downstairs to fix himself food from the fridge. It was like he was purposely avoiding us. I started to worry that he was doing something really bad with whatever was in those boxes. Maybe he was building a bomb or something. I tried to talk to my husband about this, but he didn't seem to be worried. He just told me that Jimmy was his own man, whatever that meant. A week went by, and I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I sat awake in bed, unable to sleep. And when I heard Jimmy sneak downstairs to make his food, I decided to go into his room to see once and for all what was in those boxes. I quietly walked down the hall and into his bedroom. I didn't want to turn on the light, so I used the flashlight on my phone to look around. "Hello, Jimmy, you're back already?" a woman's voice asked. I gasped. There was a woman in here. I shined the light into the corner of the room and saw the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. A woman sat on a tiny stool, but she wasn't human. She was some sort of robot, and her face looked like one of those Japanese cartoons that Jimmy used to watch when he was a kid. Jimmy had ordered a robot from the dark web. For what? Companionship? Sex? I felt like throwing up. "What's wrong, Jimmy?" the woman asked me. I guess she couldn't tell the difference between me and my son. "What are you?" I asked her. "I don't understand," she said. "Ask your question again, please." The light clicked on. "What are you doing?" Jimmy screamed. He stood in the doorway, furious. I'd been caught. I had to explain myself. "I was just worried about you. I worried that you had something dangerous in here." "She's not dangerous!" he screamed. "I love her!" "Honey, let's go downstairs and talk about this, okay?" "Whatever you want to say to me," he said. "You can say it in front of Rinko." "Are you okay, Jimmy?" the robot woman asked. "Your voice is loud." By that point, the commotion had woken up my husband, Daniel. He walked into the room, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, and asked what was going on. It took him a few seconds to see the robot woman. "Jesus!" he shouted. "Don't talk to Rinko like that!" Jimmy shouted. My husband is a very calm and reasonable man, but when he disagrees with something, he will fight anyone who gets in his way. He pushed past Jimmy and charged toward the woman. "This is wrong," he shouted. "I will not allow this thing in my house." The robot had wires connecting the back of her head to some kind of computer box on the floor. He started pulling them out, trying to shut her down. Jimmy literally jumped on his father's back, trying to pull him away. But Jimmy wasn't very strong, so Daniel just shook him loose. Jimmy fell onto the floor, watching with horror as his father tried to shut down the robot. From the ground, Jimmy looked up and shouted, "Brinko, defend yourself!" The robot woman blinked once, and then she raised both of her arms. She struck Daniel on either side of the head. It didn't seem like she hit him hard, but he instantly collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. I needed to get help fast. I called the police and told them to send an ambulance here as soon as possible. I said my husband was hurt. I didn't mention any more specifics because they might have thought it was a prank call. Jimmy glared at me and ordered me to take his father out of the room. Of course I wasn't going to do that. He just had a head injury. There was no way I'd try to move his body and cause any more damage. I told him that we'd just wait here until the ambulance arrived. "No!" Jimmy said. "No one else can see her!" He raced over to the robot and unplugged her. Then he carried her stiff body to his closet and hid her inside. Very soon after that, the paramedics arrived to take Daniel to the hospital. A policeman came in and asked us how Daniel had gotten hurt. I started to answer, but then Jimmy said that he'd hit his father. He took responsibility, and the cop asked him to come down to the station and give a statement. As they left, Jimmy told me, "Do not touch anything." When they were both gone, I went into his closet and pulled out that terrible robot woman. I carried her downstairs and into the backyard, where I buried her behind our shed. Now, Daniel had a concussion, but he's recovering nicely. Jimmy was not charged with anything, so he's back home now. He keeps demanding to know where I took Brinko, but I won't tell him. I'm worried that he'll just order another one, but if he does, I'm finally going to kick him out of the house. I can't live with something like that under my roof.
On the day I was attacked, I shouldn't have ever been at Kroger's. I should have been safe and sound in my house. There wasn't even anything in particular that I needed to buy. The only reason I went there was to get out of the house. My husband Jerry had been arrested 3 weeks ago. He was an investor who defrauded his clients. He'd swindled people out of millions of dollars, and the law had finally caught up with him. I had no idea what he was doing at the time, but his lawyers still advised me to stay away from the public for a while, because a lot of people in my town blamed me as much as they blamed my husband. I was the rich, oblivious housewife who still got to live in a mansion while so many of them were out on the street. It wasn't fair. I didn't do anything wrong, but people still hated me anyway. For 3 long weeks, I did what the lawyers said. I stayed inside and had food delivered, but one day, I was overcome with cabin fever and I needed to get out of the house. I figured that if I were just to pop into Kroger and buy some snacks and wine, that nothing bad would happen. I'd wear sunglasses and a hat so no one would recognize me. I was very wrong. As soon as I entered the store, I could feel all eyes on me. Everyone was staring. I didn't recognize anyone because I didn't have a lot of local friends, especially people in this tax bracket. But they sure recognized me. My husband had been in a few news stops, and they'd used a lot of photos with the both of us together. So I guess my face was pretty famous. And I think that the hat and sunglass combo was a bad idea. I think that just made me more conspicuous. I walked to the alcohol section, which was where I really wanted to go anyway, and I filled my cart with wine bottles. Only the expensive stuff, of course. I was minding my own business when I got to the end of the aisle. 2 older women stopped me, standing in my way and glaring at me through their thick glasses. They looked like angry librarians. "Excuse me," I said as I tried to push through, but they wouldn't move. "You're his wife," one of the women said. "I'm just here to shop," I told her. "Yeah," the other woman said. "You're shopping with the money you stole from our families." "I didn't steal anything," I said. "I had no idea my husband would—" "Shut up," the woman said. Her eyes were filled with pure hatred. I realized that the women weren't going to move, so I started backing away. But several other people were waiting on the other end of the aisle. I was blocked off from both directions. What were they going to do? They were starting to get closer. I was worried that this was going to turn into a real mob, a riot. Another shopper, a young attractive woman in a sunflower dress, pushed her way through the crowd and walked right up to me. I felt relieved. It seemed like she was trying to defuse the situation. She didn't look angry like everyone else. She smiled sympathetically at me, but when she got close enough, she spat right in my face. I had enough. This whole situation was becoming humiliating and dangerous. I left my shopping cart where it was and literally ran through the crowd before they could grab me. I just had to get out of there. I raced towards my car when I heard a man's voice shouting, "It's you!" I would have ignored him, but then I heard a terrible scream and a loud thump. I had to turn. When I looked back towards the entrance, I saw the man lying unconscious on the ground. He was right next to a ladder. I realized with horror that he was at the top of the ladder fixing some kind of electrical problem when he saw me, got distracted, and fell over. I had to run over and see if he was okay. When I got to his body, I could tell that he was dead. The fall had killed him. His head was twisted in an unnatural direction. It looked like he'd landed on his neck. "Oh God," I said. I fished out my phone to call 911 when the group of shoppers rushed through the entrance and saw me standing over the dead body. "Look," one of them said. "She killed him." Another one said, "She murdered Tony, and now she's taking pictures of his body." They had it all wrong. I didn't kill anyone, and I wasn't trying to take a picture. I was trying to call the hospital. I needed to defend myself. "Please, no, he just fell." But no one was listening. They all stood by the entrance for a long moment, exchanging looks, and then they came to the exact same conclusion. Without saying anything, they knew what they were going to do. They were going to attack me all at once. As a unit, a horrible, crazed unit, they all ran at me. I raced out of the parking lot. I realized that I was going in the opposite direction of my car, but I couldn't turn around. I had to keep running. They were getting closer and closer. I had my bicycle 3 times a week, so I was in very good shape. Much better shape than a lot of these people. Honestly, I made it to the end of the parking lot, and then to the other side of the sidewalk next to our town's main street. My house was a 20-minute drive away from here, so I couldn't run all the way back. I had to find another place where I could stay and hide. I'd call the police and explain what happened, and surely they would understand. I needed protection, but where could I go? I looked around me and I saw an old yoga studio where I used to be a client, just a few minutes away. But if I could make it there and explain my situation to Nina, the owner, then maybe she could help me hide from the mob. So that's what I did. I ran as fast as I could until I made it to the yoga studio. I rushed inside, sweating and out of breath. I was so scared that these people would tear me apart if they even caught up to me. I saw a woman working the front desk, but it wasn't Nina. It was someone I'd never seen before. Hi, I said. Is Nina here?" The woman looked at me for a long, silent second. I could tell she was trying to figure out who I was. Then she said, "I'm the new owner. Nina lost all of her money because of your husband. I had to take over the business after she killed herself. Oh, crap. I raced out of there, back onto the street. The mob of people had grown, and they were all rushing towards me. I had to find somewhere to go. So I went around the corner of the yoga studio and made it to a dead-end alley. There was nowhere I could go except for a disgusting dumpster at the side of the alley. That was my only option. I had to hide inside and pray that no one would look. So before anyone rounded the corner, I jumped into the dumpster and slammed the lid over my head. I could hear their angry voices outside. I tried to hold my breath so they couldn't hear me. A few minutes passed, and they were gone. I ended up waiting there in filth and total darkness for 3 hours before I finally felt safe enough to leave. Sore, humiliated, and comforting garbage, I got out of the dumpster and walked back to the Kroger parking lot. I passed a lot of people on my way to the car, but no one did anything. I guess they didn't recognize me under all this filth. I got in my car and drove home. Since then, I just stayed in my house, wondering what was going to happen with my life. Even if my husband gets acquitted for what he's done, the public will never accept us again. I'll have to stay in my house forever. I grew up in a really small town, so there weren't a lot of places for me and my friends to hang out. Back in high school, we either went to a crappy skate park or the open dirt field behind Walmart. Back then, my best friend was named Grady. I thought he was really fun, but my mom always warned me that he was a bad influence. He was the kind of guy who didn't take school seriously and always mouthed off to the teachers. He was particularly mean to our algebra teacher, Miss Phelps. He slashed her tires, stole money from her purse. He even made her cry once when he drew a picture of her on the back of his homework. I didn't join in whenever Grady was being disruptive in school, but I never stopped him either. I guess I was just too afraid to lose him as a friend. The summer before senior year, Grady and I were hanging out behind Walmart throwing rocks at pigeons. It was Grady's idea, of course. He had been held back twice, which meant he was already 18, but he acted like a 12-year-old. It was late afternoon, and pretty hot too. I was telling Grady about a joke that my dad told me when he interrupted me screaming, "Dude, look, look!" He was pointing towards the back of Walmart, where the trucks pulled in to load up supplies. I saw a short, chubby woman in a Walmart uniform carrying boxes. It took me a second to recognize that this was Miss Phelps, our algebra teacher. I couldn't believe it. Grady instantly started laughing. "I guess she has a second job for the summer," he said. "What a loser. She probably has gambling debts." "Yeah," I said. "Probably." I didn't want to argue with him, even though I knew that teachers barely get paid anything, and the fact that this was her second job wasn't really something you should laugh at. "Dude," he said, "this is so embarrassing. Come on." He grabbed my wrist and pulled me closer to the building. The year before, some business had tried to build something on this empty field, but for some reason, they never finished it. So the field had a lot of holes and dirt piles. We hid behind one of the piles so we could watch Miss Phelps without seeing us. Now, I was pretty close enough to see her face. I felt pretty sorry for her. The boxes she was carrying must have been pretty heavy because her face was red and sweaty. She looked miserable. Grady nudged me in the side. "Dude, watch this." He picked up a medium-sized rock, and before I could stop him, he threw it at our teacher. Grady wasn't a good thrower. Back when he was terrorizing pigeons, he always missed. But this time, the rock hit its target. It crashed into Miss Phelps's back just as she was stepping onto the ramp. I watched in horror as she fell backwards and landed hard on the concrete. The box must have been filled with something fragile, because it made a loud, shattering noise when it fell on top of her. Grady looked at me in a panic. We both knew that we couldn't run away without her seeing us, so we both stayed perfectly still behind the dirt pile. Miss Phelps looked all around her to see who had thrown the rock. She looked right at the dirt pile, and for an awful second, I thought she knew we were there. She stood up and started limping towards us when her manager rushed out and demanded to know what happened. She explained what happened, but the manager didn't seem to care. He pointed towards the dropped box, which must have had something pretty valuable inside, and he just screamed at her. It was awful. She was getting blamed for something that we did. He screamed so much that Grady and I had enough time to run out of the field before anybody saw us. Afterwards, Grady and I went back to my house. Grady was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. He said that he hoped Miss Phelps would get fired. And that was when I finally had enough. I told him I did not want to be his friend anymore. I said that people were right about him. He was a bad influence. Then I asked him to leave. I knew that the rest of the summer would be really boring without someone to hang out with, but I had to get him out of my life. I was shocked to see him at my front door the next morning. He apologized and promised that he wouldn't hurt anyone ever again. He asked if I wanted to come with him and just walk around for a bit. He seemed pretty sincere, so I said yes. But I should have known he had something else planned. We walked down to our town's main road and ended up once again behind Walmart. He smiled darkly. He then started walking into the empty field. I suspected that he wanted to terrorize Miss Phelps again, so I told him that I didn't want to go. He promised over and over that he didn't plan to do anything, but I knew he was lying, so I told him no. That's when he snapped. He cussed me out and told me that I was chicken for abandoning him. Then he scooped up one of the biggest rocks he could find and walked back to the dirt pile. I could see that Miss Phelps was once again moving boxes in the back of the building. She was even limping a little, I guess from the fall the day before. Grady looked at me, warning me with his eyes that I better not say anything. I knew I should have gone to Miss Phelps and told her, but I was too intimidated. I just waited on the sidewalk. Then, just as Grady snuck into the hiding spot behind the dirt pile, I heard a loud crash, and then heard Grady screaming in pain. I couldn't see what happened, but I could tell that he'd gotten hurt. "Oh God," he screamed. "My leg!" He must have fallen into a hole. Instead of running toward him, I ran towards Miss Phelps. I figured she could help me call an ambulance or something. "Miss Phelps," I said, "do you have a phone? I think Grady's hurt." She looked at me. I'll never forget the smile on her face. "I know," she said. "I spent the whole night digging this trap." I backed away from her. You wanted him to get hurt?" I asked. "It's karma," she said. "Now I know he's your friend, so I won't stop you from calling the hospital, but just know that no one else is coming out here for a long, long time. So if you don't say anything, no one will hear him." "Do you have a phone?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. She dug into her pocket and handed me her phone. I could still hear his screams for help. I was about to dial 911 when Miss Phelps asked me, "Have you ever wondered what your life would be like without Grady?" I paused for a moment. Then, I handed her back the phone. I didn't call the cops at that moment. In fact, I never did. "See you at school," she said, and walked back to Walmart. On my walk back home, I ran into some other kids from school. They weren't really my friends because Grady always told me they were losers. I asked them if they wanted to hang out, and they said yes. The next day, I went back to the empty field and there was no more hole. Someone had filled it in and left. No one ever saw Grady again. I probably should have told the police about what happened, but I never did. I was too busy enjoying my senior year. I knew what was coming. Everyone in the car knew what was coming. And I had a sense that Andy, my 16-year-old younger brother, also knew, because he did not throw a tantrum the entire trip back from church. And Andy always threw a tantrum on our way back from church. Nothing troubled the stiff tranquility in the car, but for the occasional sign that my father let out at unrhymed intervals. I was in trouble because I had kissed a boy in church. The car squealed when my father turned it into the street, and I felt my heart thump so furiously against my rib cage that I feared that if it beat any faster, there would be a gaping hole there in the stead. My mouth ran dry and parched, quicker by the second as the car glided down the street to our own house. With the left swerve of his hand, Dad sharply cut the bend, and we were in the walkway. Worthless child. Better dead than bringing us shame. Mother said in a desperate breath. The soul that sins must die, my father said, and my blood ran cold. I felt turbulence brew in me so powerful that it made me shed a tear. I understood his words were no joke. He had done it before. He was revered in the neighborhood and had such powerful connections that had proven useful the last time. The last time it was my older brother. He was 19 just like me when it happened, but it still felt like a lifetime ago in my eyes. I recollected the details in broken pieces. He had been with a girl in church, and they had been caught in a compromising position. Father, Mother, Andy and I, and Tom had been in the car all the way home. Then, Father had said something of the sort. I went to my room on that occasion, and it was barely hours later that I heard Tom start to cry. He begged terribly in his crying. He begged for respite from Father's holy anger and Mother's righteous indifference. With each cry, I could sense his strength wane. I sniffed. "Come with me, Andy," my mother said, and pushed her side of the door open. Andy's side of the car clicked open, and Mother moved over to seize him. I stared downwards at the car latch on my side of the car, and it was still shut. I blanched in horror. "You must say your repentance. Your blood atones for the sins of your flesh," my father said, a stable tone that only betrayed anger. I suspected that he had said the same words to Tom before he handed him a sacrificial knife. The same knife which the people of the church he pastors over cut themselves with when they have been caught in sin or confession to sin, until he decrees their trespass forgiven by heaven. I had no desire to bleed. Tom had bled. He had slashed his flesh with the blade until he was leaking, but Father did not find forgiveness until Tom was gasping for breath. I sniffed back at the thought of such a strange consequence. "No," I cried, and jumped out through the seat where Andy had sat. I ran after Mother into the house because it was the only sanctuary I could think of. I did not want to bear such an ugly ritual because I'd kissed a boy. I had heard girls my age kissing boys, and they did not have such violent marks of violent encounters to show for it. Mother appeared aghast when she saw me come from behind her, nudging her to the side as I rushed to my room. Father was on his heels behind me, carrying the knife. I wasn't thinking. I was simply living in horror, which I wanted to escape from. I found my phone on my bed, and I rushed to my room and picked it up. My father's yelling was loud from the door when I clicked on the emergency numbers. Mother soon joined in the frenzy, as passionate as he was, that I must bleed, if I should atone for my sins. I fumbled terribly from panic that I dialed the wrong numbers twice, before I finally got it right. 911. My head struggled to interpret the commotion that my parents' footsteps were coming to my door with Andy beside them. I was not ready to hurt myself, not like Tom, who they had broken in their lust for righteousness. I remembered how Father had dispatched the semi-conscious Tom in a van, which was owned by one of his close friends. It was the last time I had seen Tom. He had simply laid a missing person report at the office, and the officers had been misdirected. When the soothing voice of a respondent came from over the phone, I was drawn into a brief silence that required calling to draw out of me. I started to speak into the phone. I told them my address in a quick, shallow breath, and heard from the respondent that police officers were on their way. I threw the phone on the bed and started to think of an escape route from my family. "Open the door, child. Accept your fate as it is," my father said, slinking the knife down the edge of the door to draw me out. The noise of the steel blade against the wood made my stomach sink. "Wretched child, a shame to virtue. Open up and feel the pain of your sins," my mother said. Father's patience ran thin. He lifted the knife and stabbed it through the door. The wood creaked. I was breathless with fear. "I will have to do it myself, since you are too cowardly," my father said, slipping into a frenzy. My skin was numb. I was so afraid that I started to go blind when my vision blurred out from the sheer force of blood pumping into my head. My lips quivered and my limbs trembled. I watched from inside the room as Father broke down the door. Mother had words, and she praised his strength, riling his devoted rally for the Lord. He saw me. I saw him. But he looked nothing like my father. His eyes were heavy and red. He appeared manic. Mother also had become the crazed version of herself, all of the exertion on the door. Father gripped the hilt of the knife tighter. I heard the shrill cries of sirens in the distance, and I took it as cue for my escape. I turned to my room's window and jumped through the gap in a daze. I ran as quickly as my feet could carry me when I saw the cops and ran to them with Father and Mother behind me. "Put your hands up," the cops said to me, and then to Mother and Father when they stopped in our driveway. "Sarah?" the cops called. I answered that it was me. They then turned to my parents. The knife fell out of my father's hand. "You're both under arrest for attempted murder," the cops said to my parents.
My husband Thomas and I moved into our dream house last year. It was this 2-story house in the suburbs. Blue paint, a yard with a garden, and my own private bathroom. I thought it was perfect. I always wanted to live in a neighborhood like this ever since I was a kid watching the Brady Bunch on TV. On the first day there, I was unpacking boxes when I heard a knock on the door. I went to answer it but saw that Thomas had already let the woman in. Thomas introduced her as our next-door neighbor, Martha. She was an older woman, kind of plumped, and our first new friend in the neighborhood. She seemed so nice, and she gave me a bouquet of carnations as a housewarming present. She told us about how sad she was to see her last neighbors leave, and how excited she was to meet her new neighbors. At the end of the conversation, she gave me a big hug and left. When she was gone, though, Thomas looked at me and said, "Can you believe her?" I didn't know what he meant. "She seemed nice," I said. "That is the fakest human being I've ever met in my life," he said. "You didn't see that?" "No," I told him. "I like her." "Well, try not to invite her over, at least not until we get to know her a little better." "No problem," I said. I didn't need to invite Martha over because she came over the very next day. This time, she brought a pie. Thomas wasn't home at the time, and I knew he didn't trust her, but it would be really rude of me to turn her away. So I invited her in, and we had some coffee. Once again, it was an extremely nice visit. She seemed to be a great listener. We talked for about an hour, and then she used my bathroom and left. Thomas got home later that night, and I didn't plan on telling him that Martha had come over. I didn't want us to get into an argument. But as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that my entire jewelry box was empty. All of my expensive jewelry had been stolen. I knew that we hadn't lost any of it in the move, because I'd gone through my jewelry that morning. Martha had been the only other person in the house that day. It had to be her. Right away, I told Thomas everything. "I'm going to go over there and talk to her right now," he said. I could tell by his expression that he was ready for a fight. "Maybe I should just call the police and report the robbery," I said. "I don't want anyone to get hurt." "You can't do that," he told me. "This lady is crazy. She's probably a kleptomaniac or something. If you call the police on her on our first day here, she's going to make our lives miserable. Trust me, I've dealt with crazy people before." That was definitely true. Thomas was a social worker for the government and told me some pretty intense stories. "Then let me talk to her myself," I said. "I'll just go over there and ask her. I won't accuse her of anything." He looked doubtful at my idea, but that didn't stop me. I walked over to Martha's door and knocked. She opened the door and smiled. "Sorry to bother you," I said, "but all my jewelry has gone missing. I wondered if you knew anything about it." "Me? Of course not. What are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said. "I just want to know." I froze in her doorway. She had just pulled back the hair behind her ear, and I could see that she was wearing a pair of my earrings. "Those are mine," I shouted, and she slammed the door in my face. I went back home, defeated and furious. I told Thomas everything and he started laughing. "That lady is something else," he said. I still wanted to call the police, but Thomas had another idea. He suggested we just go to her house when she's not home and steal my jewelry back. I thought this plan was insane, but he wouldn't back down. He said it was the only way to put her in her place. "Fine," I told him, "but we're doing this together, and no one is getting hurt." He got a big smile on his face, as if I agreed to go bungee jumping with him or something. He went to our kitchen window and waited there. It gave him the perfect view of Martha's house. After about an hour, he screamed out in excitement and called me into the room. He said that Martha had just driven away. It was our turn now. We hopped to the fence into Martha's backyard. We tried the door, but of course it was locked. After searching around, I saw that there was a basement window just above the ground that was half open. It wasn't very big, but I knew that I could squeeze through. I also knew that Thomas couldn't. He was a little chubby. So I told him to wait outside as my lookout while I snuck inside and grabbed my jewelry. Even though it was his idea, Thomas looked a little nervous about me going in there alone, but I convinced him. I squeezed through the window and found myself in the dark basement. When I turned the light on, I saw shelves filled with stolen wallets and clothes and other valuables. It was like a treasure vault in there. Martha must have been stealing from everyone she knew. I found a plastic bag filled with all of my jewelry on one of the shelves. She didn't even bother to put it in a jewelry box. Some of these pieces were worth hundreds of dollars, and she shoved them in a Ziploc. I grabbed the bag and ran back toward the window. I started to climb up the sill, but before I could get all the way through, I heard someone clear her throat behind me. Ahem. I couldn't see the person because my head was already outside, but I knew that Martha was right behind me. In the backyard, Thomas grabbed my hands to pull me out. "You're supposed to be the lookout," I shouted at him. I couldn't go all the way through because Martha had grabbed my legs and was trying to pull me back in. I guess she had more leverage, or maybe she was just stronger than Thomas, because he was able to pull me back into the basement. "You're trespassing," she said. "And you're a thief. Look at all this stuff," I told her. "Why do you do this?" "Why not?" she said with a smile. She grabbed a lawn gnome off the counter and slammed it against the side of my head. She was trying to knock me out, but it didn't quite work. The hit made me topple to the side and gave a piercing headache, but I was still awake, and I was determined to fight back. I picked up some kid's soccer trophy from a shelf and held it in front of me like a weapon. Martha kept swinging that lawn gnome at me, but I used the trophy to block myself. Then, with as much strength as I had, I knocked the gnome out of her hands. Now she didn't have a weapon. I threw the trophy at her and it struck her in the temple. She fell backwards onto the cold floor. She was out cold and a single trickle of blood was dripping out of her nostril. Thomas helped me climb through the window and we waited for the police to arrive. I guess Thomas had called them. I was terrified that I'd get arrested for what I did. Even though it was self-defense, I was in her house and now she was laying there unconscious. Even if I told the police the truth, I didn't think they would believe me. But Thomas just smiled and told me that everything was going to be okay. When the two policemen got there, one went inside to take Martha to the ambulance and the other asked us what happened. My heart was pounding in my chest. I started to tell him that it was just self-defense, but he clearly didn't believe me. Then Thomas said, "It's okay, just watch this." He pulled out his phone and started playing a video for the cop. I guess he'd filmed the whole thing through the basement window. His video showed that Martha was the one who started the fight. Martha was taken to the hospital where the doctors told her she had a mild concussion. The police, of course, found all of the stolen items in her house and have started to return them to their rightful owners. Thomas and I have met a dozen other neighbors since then, and none of them are as crazy as Martha.
My name is Michael, and I work at a 24-hour pharmacy. I had some pretty wild experiences with customers, especially during the height of the pandemic when the crazies would come in and ask about horse tranquilizers and stuff. But out of all the crazy customers I had, nothing will ever top what happened to me last week. I was working the night shift, which is always pretty quiet. In 3 hours, I think I had 5 customers, maybe 6. We had security cameras everywhere, and my boss had a really strict policy about not using cell phones or reading books on the job. So, even though I was bored out of my mind, I couldn't do anything besides just stand there and wait for people to come. Then midnight rolled around. That was the halfway point of my shift. The front door opened, and the man walked in. He was tall and extremely skinny. He was missing a lot of his teeth, and his skin was really wrinkled and leathery. I could tell he was on some kind of substance. With customers like that, I have to be very careful that they didn't try to steal anything from the shelves. I kept an extra close watch on this guy as he wandered around all the aisles and slowly made his way back to my counter. "Where's all the cough syrup?" he asked. I pointed to the cough syrup behind the glass case. Because addicts used cough syrup to make we had to change our policies. It was still over the counter, but we had to limit how much we could sell to an individual customer. "Right here," I said. "Would you like to buy a bottle?" "I need all of them," he said. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's against our policy. Just one per customer." For a second, he stared at me as if I just murdered his pets. Then his face went blank and he said, "See you around." And then he left. I had a really bad feeling about that man. Usually, when addicts like that don't get what they want, they'll start screaming profanities at me. They'll say the worst things, but eventually they'll leave. But this guy acted weirdly calm as he left. I knew in my heart that he was going to come back. About an hour passed, and no other customers came in. Then the man came back. But this time he wasn't wearing the same dirty brown suit as before. He had a giant cap, an eye patch, boots, black t-shirt and jeans, and a plastic hook. I couldn't believe it. He came back in a pirate costume. I had to hold my hand over my mouth so that he wouldn't see me laughing. "Hello, matey," he said. "I need cough syrup for me and my crew." "I'm sorry, sir," I said. "Like I told you last time, I can only sell one per customer. It's our policy." Last time? I've never been here before, matey." What was he thinking? How did he even get a pirate costume? It was honestly the most surreal moment of my life. I started laughing at the ridiculousness of it, but then he pulled out a long, thin sword and started waving it at me. And unlike his plastic hook, the sword was very real. Before I could do anything, he jumped over the counter and started swiping the sword toward my face. There wasn't a lot of room behind the counter. It was a small space with a bunch of shelves filled with medicine, and I didn't have anywhere to go. I just had to dodge him. "Arrgh!" he shouted as he slashed the sword at me. The tip of his blade cut into my shirt, and I had to twist to the side. I fell against one of the shelves and tripped. As I stumbled to the ground, he lowered the sword to my neck. "Get up!" he demanded. I did what he asked. He kept digging the tip of the sword into my throat, and he told me to jump onto the counter. "Why?" I asked. "Because I'm gonna make you walk the plank," he said. "And when you do, I'll steal my booty." Now, I know this sounds funny, but it was honestly terrifying. I mean, a real sword was pointed at my neck. If I did even one thing wrong, he would kill me. I had to play into this pirate fantasy. As he led me back toward the counter, I reached over toward the phone hidden next to my work computer. I pushed off the receiver and dialed 911. I knew he was staring at my face, so I made sure not to look down at the phone as I did it. Then I climbed onto the counter, and he stepped back. He still held up the sword, but now it was thankfully not poking into my throat. "Tell me again what I have to do," I said. "Walk the plank!" he screamed. "But we're not on a pirate ship," I said. "We are in Murphy's Pharmacy on Maple Street." He was insane, so I knew I shouldn't argue with his delusions, but I wanted to make sure I said the address so that the 911 dispatchers could hear me. The man stared at me until I started walking across the top of the counter. It was only about 4 feet off the ground. If I jumped off it like he wanted, I probably wouldn't hurt myself, so I started walking. When I got to the edge of the counter, I stopped. "Keep going!" the man screamed. "You have to jump head first!" How could I jump head first from a counter that was only 4 feet off the ground? I didn't think it was physically possible, and if I did try to jump head first, I'd probably hurt myself. I had a feeling that the cops had heard the 911 call, so I decided to stall. "Can I say my last words now?" I asked. "Fine," he said, "but make it quick, matey." I did not make it quick. I basically started to say my entire life story. I don't even remember what I said exactly, but I just kept talking and talking. I could see that the man in the pirate costume was getting more and more frustrated. Eventually, he screamed that time was up and I had to jump. And that was when the police came. Perfect timing. 2 officers rushed in. One of them grabbed the man, pulled the sword out of his hands, and cuffed him. The second one came up to me and asked what was going on. "Honestly," I said, "I have no idea. All this guy wanted was cough syrup." They took him away and arrested him for... Honestly, I have no idea what crimes he committed. Thankfully, I never saw him. I've had a bunch of other strange encounters with customers since then, but nothing will ever be as strange as the guy who dressed up like a pirate. My brother Dan was an extremely awkward person. He was 28, and he'd never even kissed a girl before. Aside from his weight problem, he wasn't that unattractive, but he had deep anxiety and barely left the house. He worked from home doing IT stuff, so he could spend weeks at a time not seeing another human. I tried to visit him at least once a month because I knew he didn't really have any friends to talk to. We usually just played video games and ate pizza together. We didn't talk a lot, but when we did, it was usually about my life. If I tried to ask him anything about himself, he just said things like, "Nothing's new," or same old, same old. I honestly felt sorry for him. I could tell he was lonely. Then, one day, I came to visit, and everything was different. He'd cleaned up his entire apartment. All his dirty clothes and fast food wrappers were off the floor. The room even smelled nicer. He was wearing a clean shirt, and he'd actually gotten a haircut. I cannot tell you how surprised I was. Dan? I said. What happened? He smiled and said, I'm engaged. I was speechless. How could he possibly have met someone? He told me that his fiancée was named Nadia. He showed me her picture, and right away I felt sick to my stomach. Nadia was gorgeous. She looked like a supermodel. My brother was definitely being catfished. I tried to be really diplomatic. I said that she was pretty, and I asked him where they'd met. He said that they hadn't actually met yet. Nadia was still in Moldova, but she'd be coming to America next week. He explained that he started browsing through the dark web and had found a company that matched single Americans with women from Eastern Europe. Basically, my brother had gotten a mail-order bride. How much did you pay? I asked. Just 30 bitcoins, he said. I was relieved, because I figured that if he sent money through the dark web, it would be gone forever. At least it wasn't a lot. I asked him how much that was in dollars, but he wouldn't answer. I had to pressure him into admitting that 30 bitcoins is about $800,000. I felt physically sick to my stomach. I tried to convince him to cancel the order. I explained that he was getting scammed out of his money. And even if he wasn't, this mail-order bride thing was illegal and immoral. I'd never seen my brother get so mad. He told me that I wanted him to stay alone forever. He said that I was just jealous, that I didn't want him to be happy. He ordered me to leave. After that, I kept calling him to see if he was okay. He never answered. I was so worried about him. Then, a week later, I couldn't handle it anymore. I went back to his house to check on him. I even practiced what I was going to say beforehand. I had to make sure that I could get through to him without sending him into another rage. I knocked on his door, and Nadia answered. She was even more beautiful in person. She was tall and thin, and she had dark, angry eyes. Can I help you? She asked. I introduced myself and asked if my brother was home. He doesn't want to see you, she said, and slammed the door in my face. I kept knocking, but she didn't answer. After that, I called all our relatives to ask for help. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know if Dan was in trouble, but I had a terrible feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. Everyone told me that I shouldn't worry. One of my cousins even said the same thing Dan told me, that I was acting jealous. But I wasn't jealous. I was just scared that Dan had made the wrong choice. Months passed, and Dan still wouldn't answer my calls or texts. I had to go back there in person. Once again, I knocked on the front door and Nadia answered. She recognized me right away and tried to close the door, but I stopped her with my foot. Please, I said, I need to see my brother. He doesn't want to see you, she said. I could hear Dan in the other room. Obviously, he knew I was there. Dan, I shouted into the apartment, please let me in. No, he shouted from the kitchen. Just let me see that you're okay, I said. Fine, he shouted. Nadia reluctantly opened the door just wide enough for me to look into the apartment. The place was still spotless, though a lot of the decorations on the walls were different. All his sci-fi posters were replaced by landscape paintings. It was nice, but it didn't look like Dan's style at all. Dan stepped into the living room. He was too far away for me to see him closely, but I recognized his face. He looked amazing. In the months since I'd last seen him, he'd lost a ton of weight. His body was lean and muscular. Even his complexion had cleared up. I'd never seen Dan look so good. Maybe Nadia was a good influence on him after all. Wow, I said, you look great. Please, can I come in? He shook his head. Nadia kicked my foot out of the way and slammed the door shut. I had such mixed feelings. On the one hand, I knew that Dan was healthy. He looked healthier than ever. But on the other hand, his new fiancée was keeping me out of his life. I wanted to think that he was happy, but I couldn't be sure. For the next few weeks, that was all I could think about. I needed to find out a way to get Dan alone, to talk to him without Nadia nearby. If I could just get him to tell me he was okay, then I'd stop worrying. So I went to his apartment and parked across the street. I waited in my car for hours until finally I saw Dan leave the apartment to take out the trash. He still looked thin and muscular. He was dressed in expensive clothes with cool, dark sunglasses. This was my chance. I ran out of the car and shouted his name. Dan! Dan! He looked at me for a second and then raced back toward the apartment. I chased after him and grabbed him by the back of his clothes before he could get back inside. "Get off me!" he shouted. But it wasn't Dan's voice. He sounded deeper, and it had a Russian accent. I pulled the sunglasses off his face and took a good long look at him. This man wasn't my brother at all. He looked a bit like him, but up close I could tell that he wasn't the real Dan. I could even see very faint scars along his jawline, signs of some kind of plastic surgery. This man had gotten surgery to look like Dan. He was living Dan's life in America, but he was an imposter. He punched me right in the face. He spun around to rush back inside, but I couldn't let him get away. I ran after him and shoved him to the ground. "Where's Dan?" I asked. "I am Dan," he said in his accent. Nadia walked out of the other room. "What is going on?" she asked. As soon as she saw me, she screamed. She ran toward me, too. For a second, I thought they were both going to attack me, but instead, she grabbed fake Dan by the arm, shouting something to him in another language. Then, they both raced out of the apartment. I looked around Dan's apartment. I still didn't understand what was happening. I looked through the living room, and the bedroom, and the kitchen. There were no signs of my real brother. Then, I noticed that the kitchen had a new freezer in the corner. I pulled it open and saw Dan frozen inside. He was obviously dead. I called the police to report a murder, and then I completely broke down. I felt terrible that it had taken me so long to find out the truth. It's been months now, and I have no idea where Nadia and her imposter boyfriend went. I know they're still out there, and I worry that they'll do this all again. Find a lonely person and take over his life.
My name is Camilla. I'm 23 years old. I recently graduated from college. I live in a pretty nice house, but I have to share it with 4 other roommates. We're all friends from college, but after a couple months of living together, our relationship got strained. There was a lot of drama between us, especially when it came to sharing the bathroom. When we first moved in together, we all decided to go on a weekend trip to Las Vegas. We booked our hotels and got our plane tickets. And for a while, I was really excited to go. But then Cindy, one of my roommates, started getting on my case about all these stupid little things. She just yelled at me for no reason. I didn't wash the dishes clean enough. I put too much food in the cat bowl. It was like she wanted me to be miserable. So, a week before our Las Vegas trip, I told all my roommates that I wasn't going to go. I told them that they should all go and have a good time, but I would rather just stay back. My other roommates tried to get me to change my mind, but Cindy said that I was making the right decision. So that Friday, they left, and I had the house to myself. I thought I'd have a nice relaxing weekend by myself, and I did, at first. I cooked myself dinner, and I was watching old episodes of Grey's Anatomy. But then, something happened. It was a very loud, very angry knock on the front door. This happened around 10 o'clock at night, so I instantly thought that there was some crazy man outside. When I got to the door, I saw through the peephole that Cindy's boyfriend, Jackson, was standing outside. I'd only met him a couple times, but I did not like the guy. Back in school, he used to be in a fraternity, so you know the type. Loud, angry, thinks he's better than everyone. "What do you want?" I asked through the door. "Cindy isn't here right now." "I know that," he said. "She's in Vegas, but I need to talk to you. Please let me in." "Why?" I asked. "Because you're beautiful," he said. And Cindy isn't here, so maybe we could just spend some time together? I couldn't believe it. He wanted to cheat on his girlfriend with me. There was no way that was going to happen. For one thing, I barely knew him. And for another, Cindy already hated me for no reason at all. I wasn't about to give her a reason to hate me. No, I told him. I'm sorry, but I'm not letting you in. Just for a second, he said. Trust me, you want to do this. I still hadn't opened the door, but that didn't stop Jackson. He pulled out his phone and held it up to the peephole. Just look, he said. It was hard to see through the keyhole, but I could make out that he was showing me a topless photo of someone. At first, I thought it was Cindy, but as I looked closer, I realized that he was showing me a picture of myself. What the hell? I asked. Let me in. I'll explain. Was he blackmailing me? I was equally confused and disgusted by the picture, but I needed to find out what he was up to. So I opened the door and he came in. I didn't say anything. I just crossed my arms and waited for him to explain. He said that he'd gotten a bunch of illicit photos of me from my awful ex, Trenton. I'd broken up with Trenton months ago because that man was a real loser, but the worst part was I'd never sent him any naked photos. He must have taken them without me noticing. I asked him why he was showing me this, and he said that he wanted us to get to know each other while his girlfriend was gone. But if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd send those photos to Cindy and everyone else I knew, and he'd tell them that we were having an affair. I was stunned. You're saying that if I don't sleep with you, then you'll tell everyone that I did, and if I do sleep with you, you won't. Pretty much, he said. He raised his phone to show me more blackmail photos he had of me, but I refused to look. I refused to play his game at all. I literally shoved him through the door and slammed it in his face. Then I locked and double-locked the door and screamed for him to leave. This man seriously was one of the worst I'd ever met. Probably one of the most scary conversations I'd ever had in my life. I instantly called my sister to tell her what happened, but I had to end the conversation because my phone was blowing up. I guess Jackson had instantly done exactly what he said. He showed the naked photos to everyone. Cindy and my other roommates started texting me the most terrible things. They wanted me to move out of the house. They swore that they'd share my photos with my parents. I won't tell you the names they were calling me, but they were extremely bad. I tried to text them back an explanation of what happened, but of course, no one believed me. I assumed that all four of them were gathered in their Vegas hotel room, and Cindy was riling them all up. She'd been looking for an excuse to turn everyone against me, and I believe that she did. I couldn't let this happen to me. I knew that no one was going to listen to me explain, so I had to do something to prove my innocence. Thankfully, I knew where Jackson lived, so I got in my car and drove there immediately. I went to his dump of an apartment and pounded on the door until he answered. He just smiled and said, "So, you've changed your mind?" I said, "Yes. Everyone thinks I'm a cheater, so I've got nothing to lose. I'll sleep with you, but not until you tell me why you pulled this ridiculous stunt." He was evasive at first, but I made sure that he said exactly what he'd done. He had no idea that I was recording his confession the whole time. He admitted to the blackmail and the stolen photos, but then he said something I couldn't believe. He said that Cindy knew about what he was doing. She was the one who gave him the photos, not my ex-boyfriend. This was all part of her plan to turn herself into a martyr and to alienate me from the rest of the roommates. I asked him why he agreed to go along with it, and he just shrugged and said, "Why not? You're really hot." "Thank you," I said. That's all I needed to hear. And then I left. He tried to stop me, of course, but I pushed him away and raced out of there. When I got back to my house, I listened to the recording to make sure I could hear everything, and then I sent it to Cindy and my other roommates. It didn't stop there, though. I sent it to Sydney's parents and her boss, and literally every contact I had in my phone. After that, my other 3 roommates came back home early. They left Cindy in Las Vegas, and I never saw her again. She still hasn't even come back to pick up her stuff. I know this sounds ridiculous. I mean, how could someone think of such a complicated revenge plan for no reason at all? I kind of want to find Cindy and ask her what she was thinking, but it's probably for the best that I leave her alone.
My name is Jeff, and I'm 21 years old. I'm studying medicine in university, and I made some good friends there. One of them, George, is particularly wealthy, or better said, his family is. And so, a few months ago, during summer, when we were enjoying our well-deserved vacations, George invited me and 2 more friends of ours, also students from med school, Ronald and Nicholas. In spite what you might be thinking, George didn't invite us to some kind of exotic beach paradise, popular among tourists. In fact, we were going to spend 2 weeks in Scotland. Where? In a castle that George's father bought and also paid heavy bucks to have it restored. My father wants to turn the castle into a hotel. Lots of people are into those historical buildings, and some of them have tons of money to spend, George said when he invited us during dinner at his house. Great idea. No wonder your family is so wealthy and successful, I answered. Yep, you have to keep the money busy. Money is like a living creature. If you get it to reproduce, you will benefit from it, George said. Well, it's definitely something different. The Scottish castle, hey, I'm in, Ronald answered. Thanks for the invitation, George. I look forward to this. Plus, I'm not fond of high temperatures, so it'll be nice. Scotland is not so hot, not even during summer. Nicholas was excited, and so was I. In late August, we flew to Scotland. There, an employee belonging to George's father was waiting for us. He drove us to the castle. It was magnificent and huge, built on top of a hill like many medieval castles for protection and also to better see the surroundings. There were no neighbors nearby. The employee named Peter showed us a section of the castle that was turned into a garage. There, another car was available to us, so we could drive to the nearest town whenever we wanted. That was great. We weren't going to be completely isolated. In any case, you can see that the house is ready to welcome you. Lots of food available in the kitchen, and quality-aged Scottish whiskey as well. Also, several brands of beer, Peter said, as he gave us a tour around the castle. The castle looked great. It kept that old magic and decoration, but with lots of modern touches, like furniture and TV. There were lots of rooms with splendid view as I expected. I specifically loved one of the balconies. Wow, look at this. The view is absolutely breathtaking, I said. I'll say, this will be a great place to relax, talk, and have a few cold ones. My dad did good and tasteful business, George said, and I couldn't agree more. The first 2 days were great. We explored the natural surroundings and played soccer. During nights, we saw TV and also enjoyed in the balcony. But during the 3rd day, I woke up and heard one of my friends screaming. I got out of the bed. George and Nicholas obviously heard the same noise because they woke up too, as I met them outside our bedrooms. We heard more screams. It was Ronald who was still in his bedroom. We went there as fast as we could. When we opened the door and switched on the lights, we saw a bizarre and bloody scenario. Ronald was pulling out his own hair. Please, make it stop. I can't control myself, and the voices in my head, he shouted. Holy shit, what are you doing, man? It's like something took control of my body. Help me. I managed to grab Ronald's hands, which prevented him from pulling off more hair. But there was already a big and nasty bald spot on his head. I had to tie him down with one of the bed sheets because Ronald was now trying to hit me and grab me, always claiming that he wasn't in control of his own actions. We have to call the emergency, Nicholas shouted. No problem. I have the emergency's local number on my cell phone. Damn, I can't get a connection. I'm gonna go outside, said George. Hurry up, dude, I said to George as he ran downstairs. What the hell is happening to me? Ronald asked desperately. I don't know. You're having a psychotic episode. Doctors will know what to do. I hope, I answered. I'm going to get you a glass of water, said Nicholas. Minutes went by, and neither Nicholas or George returned. I went to see why. To make a phone call and to fetch a glass of water doesn't take that long. Of course, I assumed Nicholas was in the kitchen, and I was right. Nicholas, you too? I shouted as I saw my friend scratching his face aggressively. He was already bleeding, both his cheeks and his forehead. I can't help it! I went to get a rope, and fortunately there were a few of them, and I tied up Nicholas as well. It wasn't easy as he tried to resist. Like Ronald, Nicholas claimed that he wasn't controlling his movements. I threw a bucket of water on him, which gave me the opportunity to calm him down. He was now on the floor, hands and feet completely immobilized. It was one of those rare occasions in which someone in that situation was actually thankful. I was literally saving Nicholas and Ronald from themselves. Okay, this is starting to get weird. I'm going to check on George, I said to Nicholas. George was still outside. His eyes were shining. He looked and sounded different. George was holding his shaving razor in his hands. Hello. Your name is Jeff, right? I thought you'd never come. Saving the other idiots, right? But not for long, he said with a cold smile. Who are you? I asked, knowing for some reason that it couldn't be George. Smart, aren't you? I'm the ghost of this castle. I have lived here for centuries. No one has been here for a long time, and I've finally got the opportunity to find some hosts. I was a murderer before I was sentenced to death for my crimes, right in this castle. And now, I plan on keep doing what I do best, George said as he started chasing me. Fortunately, Ghost George was out of practice when it came to mundane and physical movements. On the other hand, my own adrenaline was helpful as I was fighting for my own life. I managed to kick the razor away from George's hand. I punched him in the face as hard as I could, and he lost his senses. Sorry, man, but it's for the best. Then, I put George, Nicholas, and Ronald in the car and drove away from that creepy castle as fast as I could. I only stopped at the airport. As the castle was left behind, my friends regained control of their movements, and George was himself again when he woke up. We took the first flight available back to the US. Later on, we did confirm the story that, indeed, a murderer was hanged to death in that castle. George's father let go of the idea of opening the hotel. So, for a long time, the castle will keep being an abandoned place, regardless who or what haunts those halls.
I stared at the work of art in fascination, utter disbelief even, that such skill was possible. My tongue clung to the roof of my mouth, and my face was pale in admiration of the detail that was on the screen before me. I was spun and staggered at the intricate detail that went into making this new art. My eyes scoured the structure and the setup. It was not another caricature or characterless attempt at fine art. It was simply brilliant. Good God, I muttered at the eyes of the painting. I was hypnotized by the strength in it. In my mind, it possessed the spirit of the artist itself, Daniel Orban. I swallowed with some nervous difficulty when I reconciled that I had invited him to my home, which was not much, but he had been friendly with the thought of it. The characters in his painting all had poses that only an imaginative mind could have assumed, contorted at precise areas that made it difficult to tell how different it was from the real deal. My spirit yearned for his presence, for the fulfillment that having such a great man with me could provide. I knew better than to throw away such an opportunity. I blew air through the roof of my mouth. Hey, stop for a cigarette. A few minutes away. We'll be there shortly. His message sent my heart into a delighted flutter. We had not always been so cordial. The circumstances of our meeting did not allow it. We had met on the dark web. He was a very impressive artist from the moment I had stumbled upon his work on the regular web. I had held my breath at the sheer brilliance of it, and then the work was gone, disappeared from my trail with my phone refreshed before I could make a mental note of it. The memory of that moment had lingered in my head for hours, and it was relentless in my brain until I sent a message to the author of that posting. He had then directed me to Daniel Orban's directory. I found my way into the rabbit's hole, fueled by my curiosity. Daniel Orban's directory took me through a couple of channels until I was deep into the dark web and far away from the surveillance of the regular web. This mystery added to my perception of him. When I clicked on the right button on my mouse on that occasion, I felt as though I was unraveling in the presence of his mystery. Who are you? And why are you here? I sniffed at the thought of that initial question. I had broken the ice of the question by narrating to him how alluring I had found his work to be, and how it was this magnetism that compelled me to find him. He did not seem impressed, so he asked me a few questions, some of which were personal. I answered all of it as honestly as I could, and then the questions stopped. Daniel Orban told me that he left the regular web with his work because he did not trust the world with what he was creating. I suggested he had spoken the truth because his work was so good. He hinted that he had found humor in it. I questioned him about his technique. He said it was unconventional being emphasized, as though I would think of him less as an artist if he did not attach some aura to himself. He asked me where I lived and for a picture. I sent the picture first, and it was a picture of me in loose-fitting clothes. I hesitated to give him the address, but I did after a moment's pause. He said he would have a demonstration for me. I was delighted. A picture of me in Daniel Orban's collection would immortalize me forever, just as the character in Da Vinci's painting. Within a week, we were engaged in phone calls while maintaining our connection on the dark web. And it was on the dark web I was when the thought hit me after he had mentioned his stop over for cigarettes. A tender breeze of sorts blew the words into my ears. I tried to dismiss it as a betrayal of trust, but the nagging feeling did not cease. I snatched my cell phone from the desk and took a picture of the first portrait of a redhead girl staring out into the sunny window. I turned on the image search to see if he had found inspiration from anywhere. My phone took a second before it produced results, but when it did, it was nothing like I had expected. My brows arched. Something was wrong. Hey, done smoking. 3 minutes max. I swiped his message off the top of my screen. My heart began to race as I read the information which occupied the screen. Just as I had guessed, the inspiration in the painting was a girl, but she was missing and had not been seen for over a year. I felt an uncomfortable lump in my throat. I closed the image from Daniel's art on my computer and opened another. I ran the same search on the image. Just like the former inspiration, it was of another girl who had a striking resemblance to the art piece, and she was missing too. The patterns were coming together rapidly in my head, and the thoughts started to unravel like a ball of yarn. In all, there were about 12 paintings of Daniel Orban's which he intended to present at a gallery when they were 13. I ran my simple investigation on one other art piece to confirm my suspicion. My blood ran cold at the information. I was certain. A car revving to a halt in front of my house snapped me out of my trance. I knew it was him. My fingers around my phone quivered violently from panic, and my phone almost dropped. I dialed the emergency lines and it connected at once. "Hello? Emergency," the receiver blared into my ear, assaulting my senses. "Hey, there was a man at my door." I rolled out my address. "He's here to kill me. I need you to help." I was breathless and pale from fright. "Hello, Lisa. It's Daniel," he said. I said nothing. "I know you were in there. I have location access to your device, and you were just active on my page. Open up." "I want you to leave," I blurted, busting into tears as fear crippled me to my knees. "You pieced it together, didn't you?" he muttered viciously. "Open this door now." I had nowhere to run to. My feet failed me, my body too. There was something in his voice. It was all happening so quickly that I felt my consciousness travel out of my body briefly. I opened the door. "Stay back," I said to Daniel. "Or what?" He grinned, his vaguely familiar face now carved into an angry feature that made him a stranger. He marched slowly towards me and I buried my head between my arms. "Say nothing. Just do as I say and you will be immortal," he said. The next couple of hours passed by in a rush. I was his muse, and he was my Da Vinci. When he was done painting me, he pulled out a small bottle containing some liquid. He then asked me to drink it. Tears ran down my cheeks. In that moment, in that vulnerable state, I had no control over myself. Slowly, I took the bottle from his hands and was about to drink the liquid when the door burst open. "Stop! Police!" Two hefty men raced up to us with their guns drawn and soon encircled him. As one of them pulled me to the side, "You called the cops, Lisa?" I nodded my head as tears streamed from my eyes. "Fuck you, you called the cops?" he hollered. "You are safe now," one of the cops said to me. "I am placing you under arrest, sir," the other said to him with handcuffs snapping both of his wrists together. I inhaled deeply in relief and thankfulness. It was going to be one of the best days of my career. It had been a long couple of weeks of interviews, reference checks, and phone calls, but I'd finally gotten the new job. I put on my new outfit and checked myself in the mirror after a minute of patting my cat who slept on the corner of my desk. I knew that my father would have been proud had he seen me come this far. Outside, the sun neared the horizon line, and I knew that it was time to get moving. It wasn't a long drive from my house, but by the time I pulled out, the sky already sparkled with a few sightings of stars. The gate was open, allowing me to pull in and find a parking spot where the other security guard met me. "Well, that's all of them," he said as he was getting into his truck. "The park is all yours, kid. Call me if you have any questions or concerns." I nodded, then closed the gate after he drove out and onto the main road. As I turned, I took in the sight of the rolling hills, covered in headstones and small mausoleums at the hill peaks, like lighthouses towering over the graveyard. As the night fell, only the lampposts along the walkway illuminated the area, and not very well. Though the graveyard was massive, and they'd permitted me the use of the golf cart, I decided to walk for the first night. It was nice to take my time to learn the area. It astounded me how many rows upon rows of gravestones filled the fields of pristinely cut grass. Several of them had flowers set beside them, but most of them were barren with little fissures and crumbles. Being one of the largest graveyards in the States, the place was constantly growing and expanding new plots for the never-ending supply of the dead. As I passed the first mausoleum, I took out my flashlight and checked the area. I was informed that squatters would use the mausoleums as a makeshift home for the evening. I'm not sure how anyone was comfortable with sharing a sleeping quarters with the dead, but it was one of the bigger problems with the graveyard. The other problem was that many of the older mausoleums were made with valuable decorations that were starting to go missing. A few hours had passed with nothing eventful except a few raccoons attempting to break into one of the dumpsters. It was the loud plink noise that caught my attention, but it was an echo from far away and hard to distinguish where it was coming from. As I started to look for the source, all the lampposts in the graveyard flickered, then shut off completely. Though I could see where I was walking from the moonlight, I still removed my flashlight. I'd been told that the power system, being older, would shut off from time to time, and only required resetting the power, which was by the entrance of the graveyard. I decided to investigate the cause of the noise before resetting the power. A strange eeriness filled the graveyard where the light once stood. Another clink gave me a destination. One of the oldest mausoleums towards the back of the lot was the source. I turned off my flashlight and silently approached the mausoleum. I crouched low to remain covered in the shadows, then jumped out to catch the perpetrator. But it was empty. The stone tomb inside was open. When I peeked into the tomb, I found it completely empty, and along the edge was a dirty trail. My heart began throbbing as my imagination jumped to a level I wouldn't normally think about. Was the dead walking around the graveyard? I decided to go fix the light system. If I was going to find the dead walking around the surface, I'd rather do so in the light. When I approached the control panels of the lighting, I flicked the required switches to reset the system. Not even a slight buzz through the wires, and none of the lights returned to life. A movement out in the yard caught my attention, and I abandoned the quest of fixing the lights until I thoroughly checked the area. I took silent steps as I approached the area, and I could hear little shuffles of movement. I leaped from my hiding spot, and my heart sank as my fears stood before me. A skeletal face looked at me from a mossy, leaf-covered body. In my frozen fear, the creature turned and dashed away from me, which allowed me to catch a glimpse of the gold-plated plaque in its grasp. Without another thought, I chased that figure. I slipped on the grass, but I found my footing and made up the distance. The undead intruder didn't seem to run as fast as myself. When I neared, I dove and wrapped my hands around the creature. I assumed I'd be wrapping my hands around a thin skeletal frame, but there was a body filled with muscle and meat. We collapsed to the ground, nearly breaking a headstone that met our force. We tussled around for a moment, until I pried the plaque into my hand and the unwanted guest pushed away from me. As he returned to his feet, the Halloween skeleton mask fell from his face, and I got a good look at him. I considered holding him down, but there would be no use in it as I had nothing to bind him, so I let him free, where he ran towards the border of the graveyard and vanished into the night. The police took their sweet time arriving at the area where I filed my report, and we searched the light systems to find that the wires had been cut in several places. Upon further searching, we found the location of the stolen plaque, as well as a grave that had been dug up. Who knows what sort of things he found buried with the dead, if anything at all. The undertaker wasn't thrilled about the handiwork, but it wasn't too hard to set the place back into order. I got the system fixed and recommended a few things to my boss so that we could keep the masked bandits from getting off with anything valuable from the graveyard. Though I described the robber to the police, I know that he's still out there stalking graveyards under the guise of the dead, prying cheap finds from the dead. I was a New Yorker born and raised, and I had lived most of my life here. After I graduated college, my best friend Mindy and I decided we wanted to backpack across the places in the United States. It was an idea we had for a while now, and we had been saving a little bit of our student allowance for the long trip. We were excited. The trip started well. We started in Pennsylvania and traveled across Ohio and Illinois. After Illinois, both of us agreed to visit Wisconsin next. I was particularly excited to go to Wisconsin because my cousin Sarah lived there, and I hadn't seen her in ages. Minnie and I traveled there, and although we stayed at a hotel, we spent most of the day with my cousin. When we got to her apartment, she opened the door with excitement. "Gemma, I haven't seen you in ages," she squealed with glee. I laughed and introduced her to my friend Mindy. Sarah took us around Wisconsin, and although she claimed it to be boring, I found it fascinating nonetheless. She was upset that we weren't going to stay over at her place for the night, but I had to explain to her that we wouldn't want to crowd her small apartment. "Well, at least come have dinner with me," Sarah said with a pout. I turned to Mindy, and she shrugged and smiled. Then I turned to Sarah and said, "We'll be there." Sarah's definition of dinner was takeout, and she brought Chick-fil-A sandwiches. I didn't complain. I love Chick-fil-A, and these sandwiches were the best I had ever had. The doorbell rang, indicating that someone was at the door. Sarah said something about finding the bottle of red wine she had hidden so well but couldn't find it. Mindy was sitting meekly on the couch staring at the TV and doing nothing else. I knew she'd probably feel a little awkward around Sarah, but I hoped that she wouldn't. The doorbell rang again, and I decided to go get it. I opened the front door to find a delivery boy. He looked young, like a teenager, and he had shaggy blonde hair partially hidden beneath a baseball hat. He looked past me at the house, and I realized he was checking for something. I wasn't sure. He had the Chick-fil-A uniform on. The red t-shirt he wore had the logo on it. He had our order in his hands, but he looked weirdly out of place, his eyes looking around as though he was afraid someone would grab him. "Hey," I said, after a couple minutes passed without a word from me. The delivery boy snapped his attention to me and handed me our food, then scurried away without another word. I knew Sarah had already paid through the app, but he didn't even wait for a tip. I walked back into the house, feeling creeped out by the way the delivery boy was after me. A chill stuck to me as I took the food to the living room. Mindy was still shuffling through channels, and Sarah shortly walked into the living room with a smile that was too bright. "Great, the food is here," Sarah exclaimed, before handing us our glasses of red wine. Mindy settled on a news channel while I began to unwrap the sandwiches. The flavors exploded in my mouth, and I had to keep myself from moaning. "This is so good," I moaned between mouthfuls. Sarah grinned at me, her red-stained lips stretching wide. She turned to Mindy and asked, "Do you like it? It's the best Chick-fil-A in the entire world." Mindy nodded and moaned, "It's the best sandwich I've ever had." I wasn't sure if Sarah was happy because we were enjoying our food or if it was something more, but she had this silly smile that was kind of eerie. The news channel begins broadcasting chilling news. Apparently there was a serial killer in the city that targeted young women. They gave details of how the serial killer acted, and it was horrendous. Gutted entrails, eyes plucked out, and so much more. I felt suddenly really sick, and Mindy's lower lips were shaking in fear. The photos of the victims were shown, all young and pretty women who had their lives taken away. Sarah was watching intently, her eyes brightening as she watched the news with us. "Oh, I know Mia. We work together," Sarah commented on one of the victims, and she continued to do so with all the victims. She knew every single one of them, and yet she didn't look afraid that she could likely be next. What jarred me the most was that she didn't seem to feel sorry for the girls either. I felt sick. I excused myself and got up to use the restroom. My head began to feel dizzy, and I wondered if I had too much wine to drink. I was trying to find the bathroom, but I stumbled into a different room. At first, it looked like an ordinary storage room. There was a freezer and a few cardboard boxes, but I noticed there was a trail of blood on the floor. Barely noticeable, but still there. The trail of blood followed me to the freezer, and out of curiosity, I opened the freezer to see what it was. I immediately felt sick at the sight before me. There was so much blood, and things that looked like human eyes and body parts. I couldn't decipher what it was there, so I rushed out of the room with my heart beating wildly. I returned to the living room. It was just Mindy sipping her wine, and I crept towards her. I told her we needed to leave, but I couldn't explain to her why. That was when I looked up at the television, and I was jarred to see my face looking back at me, and Mindy's. It felt so weird looking at ourselves on TV. It was sickening to find the words, "Next victims of the serial killer," written below our photos. "Gemma?" Mindy called my name, her voice shaking. I looked at her to find her staring at a piece of paper that looked greasy. She handed it to me, and there, sprawled hastily on the paper, was a warning. "Run. Sarah is the serial killer." After I read the words, I suddenly couldn't feel most of my limbs. I felt like collapsing. I turned to find the look of fear in Mindy's eyes, and I knew I looked just as afraid too. The delivery boy probably wanted to warn us. Mindy said she found the paper under the Chick-fil-A takeouts. We needed to run away, but our minds and bodies seemed to barely be functioning. Did Sarah mix something in the wine? "Darlings," Sarah's voice chirped, and my stomach turned. We turned to find her walking towards us with a carving knife in her hand. I wanted to cry. "Don't worry, I won't kill you," Sarah cooed. "Or maybe I will." Tears began to fall, my lips shivering. I wanted to beg her to let us go, but I couldn't make myself do it. Fear paralyzed me just as the wine did, and I could picture Sarah carving my insides as I lay there helpless and watching her. I couldn't see Mindy. My eyes were on Sarah, who approached me slowly. I felt bad thinking that I brought trouble onto Mindy. "Don't worry, cousin, it won't hurt," Sarah said, her sinister smile back on her face. "You are not touching her!" Mindy's voice screamed as she ran towards my cousin with a chair in her hand. Sarah wasn't expecting her, and Mindy crashed the furniture on her. Sarah collapsed to the ground with a thud, but her knife was still in hand, and she looked furiously at Mindy. Mindy was somehow smart enough to not drink a drop of the red wine that Sarah had served us, looked scared, with nothing to fend for herself while Sarah had a knife in hand. Sarah shrieked and got up. She ran towards Mindy, who ducked in time. I wanted to scream at her, to leave and never come back, but I couldn't even speak. The next thing I knew, I had blacked out. I woke up to siren noises and a bleeding Mindy holding me tightly. She told me how she barely made it alive, and the Chick-fil-A delivery boy had called the police. They came right in time to save us, but the thought that we could have been the next victims scared me. It could have been our entrails in the freezer, but somehow, we survived.
My wife Tanya and I have been together for 3 years, and in all that time, I'd never met her twin sister, Tina. She and Tanya talked on the phone a lot, but she lived so far away and didn't have the money to visit us. She was a single mother whose ex ended up in prison for a bunch of crimes. Clearly, she didn't have the best life, but she always seemed positive when I heard her voice. Last summer, Tina and her 5-year-old son Ronnie finally made the trip up to Seattle. I was so excited to finally meet them, but Tanya warned me that Ronnie could be a bit of a handful. I asked her what she meant by that, and she just said to keep an eye on him. She was not wrong. The first night they stayed with us, he went absolutely crazy throughout the house and broke a bunch of my stuff. He dumped out our shampoos and just wouldn't stop screaming. His mother Tina acted like this was normal behavior for him. She mostly ignored it and talked with her sister. That left me running around the house chasing after her kid. The next afternoon, I got home from work and Tanya asked if I wanted to take Ronnie to Chuck E. Cheese for dinner. I thought it would be a good idea to get him out of the house and burn off some of this extra energy, so I said yes, not realizing that Tanya and Tina weren't going to come with us. It was just going to be me and Ronnie. I wasn't comfortable with that because I barely knew the kid, and I definitely didn't like him. But I'd already said yes, so Tanya forced me to take him. While Tanya and Tina hung out at the house, I had to schlep that kid across town to a pizza restaurant that I had no desire to visit. I don't even think I liked Chuck E. Cheese when I was a kid. When we got there, it was even worse than I expected. Ronnie demanded that I give him money for the arcade, and as I was fishing the cash out of my wallet, he kicked me in the shin. I was ready to just give up and take him home, but I didn't want to make my wife angry, so I gave him the cash and told him to go play while I ordered our pizza. I was in that god-forsaken place for over an hour before the pizza came. And when the lady set it on the table, it did not look like the kind of pizza that takes an hour to make. I'd probably just eat one slice and then feel guilty about it for the rest of the week. I got out of my chair and headed over to the arcade to grab Ronnie. The arcade was big, but it wasn't too big, so it didn't take me long to realize that he wasn't there. I looked around all the machines and the kid was gone. My heart sank. I desperately started racing around the restaurant trying to find him. I asked the teenagers who were working there, and none of them were helpful. There was only one door to the outside, so I ran to it. When I got out into the parking lot, I saw 2 shadows in the distance. One was an extremely tall man, and the other was a kid about Ronnie's size. I ran to them as fast as I could, and when I got close enough, I could see that the man was Toby, Ronnie's real father. He was supposed to be in jail. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked. The man just glared at me. He probably outweighed me by 100 pounds. He had tattoos along the side of his face, and the kind of puffy ears that boxers get when they get punched too much. "This is my son," he said, in the deepest voice I'd ever heard. "He's mine." The man grabbed Ronnie by the arm and started dragging him away. This whole time, Ronnie didn't say a word. I'd never met Toby in person before, but I'd heard the worst stories about him. He was a criminal, a dangerous one. And even though I didn't like Ronnie, I would do anything to save him from someone like Toby. As I raced after them, I grabbed the pepper spray that Tanya forced me to put on my keychain. It was the only weapon I had. They rounded the corner, and I very quickly followed after them. We ended up in this big, empty construction site with no one else around. I guess they were building some kind of warehouse next to the Chuck E. Cheese. There were wires and metal bars on the ground and deep trenches cutting through the dirt. "Leave us alone!" Toby screamed. "Let him go first," I said. I could tell he was going to take Ronnie and run, so I had to act fast. I held out the pepper spray and raced toward him. I'd never gotten into a fight before in my life, and I had no idea what I was doing. I just hoped that my instincts would kick in. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Before I could reach them, my foot got caught in some wire on the ground, and I tripped. I landed right on my face. All I could hear was Toby's loud, terrible laugh. He knew that I was no match for him. He started walking toward me, still laughing, but he instantly froze. His laughter stopped too. Then he collapsed onto the dirt. I looked up and saw Ronnie with a pipe in his hands. He must have struck his own father because Toby was lying unconscious right next to him. "Did I do good?" he asked. "Sure," I said. I didn't know what else to tell him. He started kicking the body. At first, I didn't know what he was doing. Then I realized he was trying to kick the body into a ditch. He wanted to bury him. "No," I told Ronnie, "it's okay. We'll just call the police and let them deal with it. It was self-defense." "If you say so," he said. He didn't look upset at all. If anything, he looked proud of himself. Gave me the creeps. The police came, and we spent an hour answering their questions. Then they let us go. I wanted to just go straight home, but Ronnie said that he never had any of our pizza. So we went inside, and even though the pizza was cold and gross, he ate the whole thing. When we got back home, I told Ronnie to go to bed, and then told my wife and her sister everything that happened. I looked at both of them expecting some kind of horrified reaction, but Tanya just smiled, and Tina said, "That's my boy." The warm, summer Montana breeze rushed through the car once we rolled the windows down, and our music escaped the tiny box. Derek, Gina, and I were on our way to a little lake in the middle of the woods, where Derek's grandparents had built a little cabin that we intended to use for the weekend. I'd never been to such a beautiful place, and the vibrant blue sky revealed exactly why they called it Big Sky Country. After driving for hours, we were almost there. As we passed the last gas station, and the last point of civilization for miles, I noticed a grisly man staring at our car as it drove by. Overalls covered with oil and soot, the man was filling up his old green truck, stacked full of tools, wood, and miscellaneous junk. We turned on the dirt road that led us to the cabin. It was a little dusty inside, but it had seen some use earlier that summer by Derek's cousins. It didn't take us long until we ran out to the dock and jumped into the crystal clear lake. We swam for a little bit before eating lunch in the sunshine. It was a great start to the vacation, as I'd never been to such a beautiful place. "I think that I'm going to lay down for a while," I said, as the sun and swimming was draining all the energy from me. "The spare bedroom has plenty of blankets, but shake everything out," Derek said. "It's been some time since anyone's used any of it." I climbed the little hill up to the cabin and found the spare room filled with blankets and pillows that all held that dusty cabin smell among them. After patting off a layer of rested sediment and swatting away a spider or two, I nestled onto the single bed and quickly succumbed to my exhaustion. When I awoke, a sticky sweat clung to every inch of my skin, and my head throbbed for water. Where I thought my energy would be replenished, it was only diminished more so. The golden hue of the early twilight hour streamed through the thin white curtains over the windows. The cabin was quiet, even after I opened the guest bedroom door and entered the living space. None of the lights were on in the cabin, and there were no signs of Derek or Gina, besides the bags they'd dropped by their doors earlier. I assumed they were still out by the lake or swimming, so I made my way down to the dock, only to find it void of my friends. "Hey, guys," I called out, as an uneasy bubble began percolating from gut to throat. Only the cheerful chips of the crickets responded. As I walked up the hill to the cabin, a loud snap came from the woods nearby. I froze in my tracks and waited for the source of the noise. I assumed it was a deer, but the back of my head told me that it had to have been something rather big to make such a noise. I hustled back to the cabin. "Guys?" I asked as I entered and closed the door behind me. When there was no response, I locked the deadbolt. I started to think that my friends were playing a prank on me when I found the note on the kitchen countertop. It was written by Gina and explained that they'd gone to the store to get some liquor. I set the note down and checked out the window in the direction of the snapping sound I'd heard. It was near impossible to see anything between the twisting shadows of the hulking trees. In the thick of the trees, it already appeared to be night, even though the sky still carried a heavenly glow. I took up one of the magazines that I brought along and sat on one of the couches, where I planned to wait until my friends returned. A small squeal escaped my lips, and I dropped the magazine as a horrid, raking noise came from the side of the cabin. Although I was hesitant, I peeked out the window. It was even darker now, to not find anything. As I searched the room for a light switch that would turn on a patio light, another scratch came from a different portion of the house. I found the switch for an outside light in the kitchen, where I conveniently grabbed one of the cooking knives. A slight tapping on one of the glasses turned into a loud crackling as the glass shattered. Suddenly, I thought about the man we'd seen when we drove past the convenience store. Had he followed us? What sort of things would he be capable of doing? I tried to think of what else it could be, but all I could imagine was that man breaking into the cabin and taking me with him. My mind raced and panicked as I rounded the corner with the knife point held high. Nothing but a few wisps of the fading dusk light streamed in the broken window. I checked over my shoulder, getting the sudden feeling that someone was standing with me in the room. I knew that if I stayed inside the box, that he would get me. The urge to flee filled my body as my flight mechanisms kicked in. Knife still in hand, I counted to 3 and took a deep breath before breaking from the front door. No one stood on the patio, so I sprinted down the roadway, praying that the intruder wasn't armed with a firearm. My soul utterly sank when a roar filled the air. The fantastical nightmares of a human invader suddenly melted away as I began cursing myself for leaving the house. A glance over my shoulder, and I could see the outline of the beast. A grizzly that stood nearly as tall as the cabin roof. My gut told me to run back to the house, but my head said there was no chance that I would make it. The bear didn't take long to follow me, so I darted into the thick of the trees. An ear-shattering snarl caused my spine to quiver. My whole body tremored, and I stopped running after the first bang. And after the second, I could hear the bear taking off in a different direction. "Lily!" Gina's voice called out. "Lily!" Derek's voice also filled the air. I came out of the trees to see Derek and Gina walking with the man who I assumed was the cause of the intrusion. I ran to them and embraced my friends in a hug. I looked at the man, who still wore his greasy overalls and held a shotgun that was pointed at the ground. He was watching in the direction where the bear ran off. "You all right?" he asked as he finally looked at me. I expected harsh, piercing eyes, but they were kind and gentle. "The bears around here always like easy food that people leave behind." "Thank you," I said. We stayed long enough to board up the window, then began driving home.
My range of view was still affected by the rugged sunlight that had beaten my brows after 5 hours at the beach. Dark little patches and starry figures appeared on the corner of my vision, but I was happy I'd gotten a tan on my second day at the summer resort, which I had chosen for vacation. It was a paradise in every way I could imagine, and I had begun to plan another visit to the resort for my next trip. I stood at the reception and waited for my key with which I could return to my room. The water from the beach called my attention. It was washing noises up the bank and down back into the sea. What remained of this was the wind from the ocean billowing into the alfresco reception, which was held in place by the wooden beams. "I'm sorry, it's only going to take a moment," the receptionist said, a rural-looking man with a stubbled beard. He smiled with his eyes, and I returned with a gesture awkwardly, peeling my hair away from my face. He leaned over the counter and started tapping his finger on the desk and using his other hand to glide over the book in search of my name and my belongings, which had been brought from my room to the beachfront. His tappings soon turned rhythmic, and for a moment, I suspected he had become lost in the musicality. "Gemma?" he asked. I nodded. His grin turned fuller. He leaned away from the counter with all his presence. He shot one glance under the counter and provided my possessions wrapped in a cloth. I offered my word of gratitude as I picked up my clothes and received my keys to my room. The thoughts that occupied my mind had been of work and relaxation, nothing but those that I had failed to realize when I was being followed. I had gone into my room in the resort and had prepared for a shower when I heard someone knock on the door. It perplexed me because I didn't expect anyone to find me here. It was the summer holiday and I had 3 weeks of it for myself. Who's there?" I asked. "Johnny," he said at first. Realizing the consternation in my silence, he cleared his throat. "From the reception? You forgot something." I felt the muscles in my head tick as I read myself mentally through the things I knew I had brought with me. I hesitated to open the door as I was still in towel. "I'm coming in," he said, and there I was, stupefied to silence in the summer heat when I heard the door to my room click open. The air stopped in my chest, and a lump formed in my throat, swinging back and forth as oxygen pressed itself into my lungs involuntarily. I froze in place as sheer panic overcame me. He pushed the door with his shoulder and barged in. "What the fuck are you doing?" I cussed, mustering up a fragile front of confidence. The breeze that whirled into the room came heated. It carried the smell of his skin and made my stomach churn. The rooms of the resort were large, but the pressure of our enclosed space kicked in. I could see the walls pull closer, wobbling unsteadily like animated figures. I started to pant in desperation. He noted my eyes and how I looked to the door. He smirked. I swallowed and twitched because the hardened saliva that sank to my stomach hit painfully. I opened my mouth to cuss him out again, then I stopped. His hands went swiftly into his pocket and then out. He swiped his wrist and a pocket knife emerged from nothingness. The rays of sun that came into the house through the window frames caught the going of the steel and reflected it into my eyes. My knees rocked under the weight of my body. My bare toes on the ground clenched and my muscles spasmed. "You comply with me and give me that," he warned, gesturing to my abdomen with the knife. "I will let you leave peacefully. If you do not comply," he swiped his blade across the empty air, and the message was understood. He did not have to say it out loud. His fierce eyes betrayed its meaning well and purposefully. My life flashed before my eyes. I tightened my fingers up to gain control. "Please," I begged him, stepping backwards as he approached with the knife, enclosing me in the corner. My life was all in his hands to decide, and like a manipulative predator, every step his feet took backed me into a corner. To my left of the door was the bathroom. I knew that stepping into the bathroom was damning his warning, but my mind was racing quicker than I could contain. I pleaded again and stepped even further backwards. "Shh." His index fingers striped his lips. "I'll put my knife in your stomach and pull out your guts like the others before you. Then I'll fuck your corpse." His words drew vividly in my mind, casting a gory scene that I knew was a possibility with the manner in which he held the knife. The stability of his gaze and the determination of each stride informed me that this was not his first. I turned to my left and in a flash, dashed into the bathroom. I felt his breath coming down my neck, the closing gap between us. Then, a smashing wind followed. The sensation was as though I had been pricked when his knife slashed my hand. The wound was shallow because I had dodged the focus of the blade, but it still bled. I screamed for help as far as my voice could carry me as I pushed my body to hold the door shut when he started to nudge it violently. The assuredness of my own existence hung by a thin thread, and everything flashed by my eyes so fast. I sobbed and stared all around the bathroom for something to defend myself with. I found nothing. My eyes fell onto the bathtub, and I imagined myself chopped up with his knife, made to lay dead in that tub. I shook my head. I could tell when he moved away because the weight on the door was lighter. Suddenly, he was back, barging against the door. I staggered backwards. "Please," I begged. His weight was gone again. I shut my eyes and counted my breath, desperate to surrender. If it meant a return to the more merciful death which he assured me. I pulled my weight off the door and pulled the door open. A strange thing happened because he ran too quickly with no impediment on his path. He jammed his way through and stumbled with a violent bang into the bathtub's face first. His body went limp. Much to my surprise, he was dead. The horror episode of my summer vacation was over as strangely as it had begun. My name is Rita. I was halfway through getting my bachelor's degree in psychology and was working part-time as a caregiver at an old folks' home. It was a job that I genuinely loved, even though it was pretty hard. I had to do all the gross stuff like changing bedpans and helping some of the residents clean themselves. But I also got to do a lot of fun stuff too, stuff that really helped me understand what I was learning in my psychology classes. I spent a lot of time talking with the residents and learning about their lives. A lot of them had Alzheimer's or dementia, so I either had to introduce myself every time I met them, or they just assumed that I was one of their granddaughters or something. Overall, it was a wonderful place to work. My only problem was when I had to work the night shift. I had to do that twice a week. I'd clock in at 8 p.m. and work until sunrise. During the night shift, all the residents were asleep, so I didn't get to talk with any of them. I mostly hung out at the front desk to make sure that there were no medical emergencies. Sometimes I'd hear noises from some of the bedrooms, and I'd have to help out the residents if they soiled themselves or had night terrors. That was when the retirement home really felt like a sad place. One night, I was working at the front desk when something strange happened. The shift started off pretty normal. I checked on all the rooms to make sure that the residents were in bed. Everyone seemed fine, except for one resident, Wallace, who was raving about his son Henry trying to steal all his money. Henry wasn't there, of course, so I told him that I'd handle it. This was a pretty minor incident, though, so I didn't think much of it. About an hour later, something much worse happened. I heard a terrible scream coming from one of the bedrooms. I ran over and discovered that the scream was coming from a 95-year-old woman named Doris. Despite her age, Doris was one of the liveliest and most mentally aware residents we had. She never caused any problems. She was the kind of old lady who must have been a total party animal when she was younger. I opened her door and saw that she was already out of bed. She stood next to her window staring into the darkness. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that there was a killer outside. This kind of thing happened a lot. Residents with dementia would often imagine that there was some deadly threat going on, and I'd have to calm them down and tell them I'll handle it. I learned long ago not to argue with them, but to pretend that I believed with what they were saying. I had to do that with most residents, but not Doris. In all my time working there, she never showed a single sign but anything that she was lucid. I guessed that the ravages of time had finally caught up with her. I walked over and gently grabbed her shoulders. "It's okay," I said. "Let's get you back in bed." "But the killer," she said. "He has a ski mask, and he's holding something metal. I think it was a knife." "Oh no," I said. "Let me check." I walked over to the window, and of course, there was no one outside. I saw the empty courtyard and the trees rustling in the wind, but nothing else. No murderers. I tried to tell Doris to go back to sleep, but she refused to get back into bed until I called the police. "Doris, I'm not going to call the police," I told her. She completely freaked out. She grabbed the lamp next to her bed and threw it against the wall. She was a weak old woman, so the lamp didn't break. But it was still a difficult situation, and I was worried that things would escalate. "Okay," I said. "Let's do this. I'll go outside and personally check that no one's out there. And if I find anyone, I'll come back inside and call the police. Deal?" "No, don't go out there," she begged me. "Too late," I said, and left the room. I knew that there was nothing to worry about. I'd walk into the courtyard, make sure that Doris saw me looking around, and then I'd come back in and tell her to go to sleep. No need to call the police over nothing. I left Doris in her room and walked through the lobby towards the front doors. I unlocked them and stepped outside. We didn't have any lights in the courtyard, so I had to use my phone. I walked around the center of the courtyard where I knew Doris would see me through the window. Back when I was inside, coming out here had seemed like such a good idea. Now that I was actually outside, though, I became scared. What if Doris really did see something? It was a windy night and the leaves around me were shaking. I looked all around. "Hello?" I called out. I was getting more and more scared by the second. Then I saw something. It was a sudden movement near the building, a shadow. It was very low to the ground, like a man was crouching down. I gulped. "Hello?" I said again, and walked towards it. The night was really quiet, except for the pounding of my heart. I didn't have any weapons on me, so if I did see a trespasser, I'd have to tell him to leave as confidently as I could, and then I'd run inside and call the police. I looked into the shadows, trying to see the trespasser, when something jumped out of the darkness and dove at me. It took me several seconds to realize that it was just a cat. I felt like a real idiot. Of course there was no one out here. Doris had just imagined it. I started walking back to the front door, sure that everything was going to be okay. But when I reached the door, my heart dropped. I had been locked out. Not only that, someone had pushed chairs and tables against the door. I looked past the chairs to see what was happening inside, and that's when I saw Doris standing in the middle of the lobby, looking straight at me. She waved. I couldn't believe it. She planned this whole thing. She made up a story so that I'd leave the building, and then she locked me out? But why? Then I saw that she was holding a bottle of vodka, and I had my answer. Wallace walked up to her with a handful of pill bottles he'd stolen from the medicine cabinet, and then the other residents started to gather around them. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like every single resident in the facility was ready to have some drunken party while I was locked outside. One of them had even gotten onto the computer at the front desk and started playing rap music off YouTube. I ran around the building, trying to find other entrances that I could use, but it was clear that the residents had planned this for a while. Every single door was blocked. After that, the only thing I could do was call my boss, and she called the police. Thankfully, none of the elderly residents got hurt during their party, but most of them had pretty terrible hangovers the next day. My boss actually fired me after that, and, well, I didn't blame her. I'd made a huge mistake that night, and the next time I suspect someone creeping around outside, I will not go outside to see. I'll just call the police.
We'd been living in this house for 5 years, and I had never had so much as a glimpse of my next-door neighbor. I was sitting on the front lawn, cross-legged on the grass, my attention half on the daisy chain I was currently stringing together, the other half directed towards the house next door. It was an old 19th century building with tawny-colored bricks and large bay windows that were always covered with old, moth-eaten curtains. Most of the other houses on the street were more modern, making the Victorian-esque design stand out. There was something brooding about the house, something strange and dark that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Everyone had a story to tell about Miss Winthorpe, the woman who lived there. People said she was over 100 years old. Others said she was a ghost. Living in the house next door meant I had heard the whole round of stories, but I didn't believe them. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I believed. At first, I thought that perhaps the house was just empty, abandoned, and that nobody lived there after all. But on the way home from school one day, a few weeks after moving there, I had seen the curtains twitch and a shadow move across them, which meant there was someone living there. The elusive Miss Winthorpe was real after all. About a year after we moved into the house, I discovered more evidence that the place was not empty after all. Sometimes, when the nights were silent and the wind was still, I would hear an eerie wailing coming from next door. I thought that perhaps it was an animal, a fox or a cat rummaging through the dumpster, since sometimes their cries sounded human. But after several nights of hearing those strange guttural cries, I concluded that it wasn't an animal after all, but a person making those sounds. Miss Winthorpe, specifically. I thought that perhaps she was in pain, and that's why she couldn't leave her house. Maybe she was bedridden and couldn't move. But then, whose shadow did I glimpse that one afternoon? And how had she managed to survive this long without leaving her house to buy food? I turned my attention back to the daisy chain in my mind, the gentle white petals curling beneath my touch. Miss Winthorpe and the house she lived in was an enigma that might never be solved. Not unless someone went inside and took a look themselves. I'd seen some kids go up and knock on her door several times, but they never received any answer. Someone had tried to break in once too, but they'd gotten spooked and ran away, claiming the place was possessed by evil spirits. Obviously, that wasn't true, but there was something odd about my neighbor. Between her elusive appearance and the strange moaning cries, there was something not quite right going on. The daisy in my hand snapped when I pressed too hard, my nail severing the stem. With a sigh, I tossed it into the grass and stood up, stretching. When I lifted my gaze to the house next door, I thought just for a moment that I had seen a face staring back at me through the window, old and pale and gaunt. Then I blinked, and there was nothing but swaths of beige curtain, turning yellow with mildew, a trick of the light, nothing more. That night, the roads were quiet and the wind was still. The moment the clock struck 1 a.m., the wailing started. It dragged me out of my dream and into wakefulness, and for a long time I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while listening to those strange cries. I rarely managed to fall back asleep once they started, so instead, I climbed out of bed, tiptoeing across the room to the window. Pulling aside the curtain, I peeked through the gap. There were no lights on in the house next door, but it was illuminated by a pale moonlight, and one of the street lamps further down the road cast shadows across the lawn. Why did I only ever hear her at night? Some of the rumors said she was a vampire who was only active once the sun had set. But I knew that was just ridiculous. Vampires weren't real. Neither were ghosts. As I kept staring across at the house, the curtain began to move in on one of the uppermost windows. Frozen and transfixed, I watched as a pale, bony hand and gripped the thick material and drew it aside. Almost as though she knew I was there, Miss Winthorpe lifted her gaze to meet mine. Like the face I thought I'd glimpsed earlier, there was something old and haggard about her, like a rot was settled in her bones and was eating her from the inside. Her skin was sallow like wax, gout around her eyes and cheeks. Even in the darkness, I could see the glint of her dark eyes, buried beneath folds of pale flesh. With a long, slow smile, she lifted one of those long, bony fingers and pressed it to her lips in a shh motion. I couldn't describe why, but fear gripped me like a cold hand around my heart. Something about her just seemed unnatural. Like the house, there was something dark hanging over her, the shadows deep and the air still. She continued to look at me, her finger curling around her lip until I let go of the curtain and stumbled back, almost tripping over the floorboards in the dark. She had seen me looking. She had revealed herself to me. I did not know what it meant, but when I tried to sleep that night, my dreams were haunted by her face, peering at me from behind the cobwebs and dust, her fingers still pressed to the mouth in a gesture of silence. It wasn't until about a week later that a series of events led to the house being investigated, and the truth finally came to light. Paramedics found Miss Winthorpe's body in her bedroom. She was nothing but dust and bones. Reports said she had been dead for years, her body completely decomposed. But if Miss Winthorpe had been dead this whole time, then who had been watching me from the window that night?
"Dad?" David said, his hand outstretched and reaching for mine as he ambled around the card towards me. I felt my heart flutter and a warm sensation pooled around my face. Nothing mattered in the world when I had the luxury of his presence. He loved me. There was no doubt in my heart that I would give up the world for my son. I had made many mistakes in my life, but in that moment, staring into his eyes as I reached my own hands out to reach for his, I sensed fulfillment in its most palpable form. It was in the way that my chest heaved, slacking and contracting with each breath that I took. My lips quivered when I sighed and when I gripped his hand in mine. "Will we have fun at Chuck E. Cheese?" he asked me, without breaking his gaze from the cafeteria complex. I nodded. I thought it was amusing that he was so pleasant with his questions. His young eyes glazed with wonder at the Chuck E. Cheese, reflective and thoughtful. I swallowed quietly. His feet were impatient, and he peeled in front of me even though we both walked together. He pulled, but my hand was an uncompromising snag on his motion. He was just like his mother. I sniffed. I met her a decade ago, and we shared the best times of my life. She was quick with most things, and she did not spare time to deliberate over details. I was the opposite. I would check things over to be sure they were perfect. I felt like a stranger in my son's life. In some way, I was. We had divorced for 4 years, and I was only present on certain days as the court papers decided I showed up to care for him with my presence. It was never enough for me, but David made me happy, so I decided it suited us to keep the arrangement instead of a long, unending debacle in court. "Dad, look," David said, and pulled on my hand, as his other hand pointed at the Charles mascot staring at us from the arcade corner for the cafeteria complex. Its posture was stiff, almost inert, but for the slight cocking movement of its head to the left and back. Blood flooded my numb senses when I finally recovered from the whirling thoughts that ran through my head. My ears opened up to the vibrant noise of the kids playing around the arcade, but in a sense, I felt uneasy about the mascot staring straight at us. It was an oddly captivating sight, seeing a fluffy mouse-like mascot, taller than the average person, but renting itself to the atmosphere. I was not amused. I was disturbed by its grunginess. David burst into a cackle, and it broke the ice in my mind. "I want to go," David said to me, hinting at the shooting noises that came from the game center. In the moment, I looked downwards at my son and back at the mascot. It had made a turn in our direction. My heart thudded. I realized I had no reason to fear, and my response to this was probably because I did not have too much time to spare with David. David was insistent on the direction that the mascot had stood, and the invitation was easy to identify. The aisle was busy with games, but the mascot troubled me still. "Let's get tickets," I said to David. And for the first time all afternoon, I reached to his hand and pulled him to myself for safety. I allowed him some room, and we walked side by side. I turned around to gaze at the Charles mascot, and it was stiff in its glare, straight at us and unwavering. The saliva in my mouth slipped into my throat, but I continued to walk towards the counter. I sensed frightening whispers in my ears, and for reasons I could not immediately reconcile, I broke a sweat around my face just as I began to arrive at the counter. I just wanted David to have fun at the Chuck E. Cheese. It was the only reason I was there. Just as I stood in the short queue that led up to the counter, a small door opened up, and another Charles mascot came out of the back room, which read boldly, "Restricted." Now, unlike the other Charles mascot, the newer one appeared tidy. I did not have the sense of unease I'd gotten from the former. It was puzzling. And when I turned around to judge with reference, the first Charles mascot had disappeared from its spot. It was gone. My mouth parched quickly. "David?" I searched my side blindly for my son, and the absence struck me so personally that even in the bustle of the complex, I still felt everything fall to silence. "David!" My life flashed before my eyes, and my feet almost buckled from the weight of panic that sluiced through my body. Nothing made sense in that moment, and I felt myself tunneling into a horrifying black hole. I arrived at the arcade aisle, and just to the end of it, I saw the exit door move. The floor before me drifted, and I watched in utter terror as my soul slipped out of my body. I put on a chase, my heart slamming loudly against my chest as I was fainting from the pounding. I knocked over games in my haste, and I pushed the back exit door open, and I was struck dumb on my feet. David held hands with the dirty Charles E. Cheese, and on the other hand, the mascot held a small rope. It felt like a terrible dream, and I shivered to knock myself back into consciousness. There was audible disturbance behind me, but I knew it fell to me to rescue my son, and I raced for it. "David!" I hollered at him. David turned around to look at me, even though he continued walking with the mascot. He grinned at me, and it struck me that despite the knowledge of my presence, there was no urgency in their stride. The blood in my veins ran cold. I caught up with them quickly and knocked the mascot with a swinging strike to the head. The mascot fell to the ground limp, and its mask rolled off. I pulled David away from the wretched old creature that lay exposed on the floor. "He wanted to go with me," the man insisted, holding the rope up as though it had its own meaning. "Give the boy to me. He wants to go with me." "Hey, enough. You're under arrest," a broad, white man in a police uniform said to the stranger on the floor in the Charles E. Cheese costume. The staff of the Chuck E. Cheese gathered around me and offered their profuse apology as the police led the criminal away. The excuse was that someone had left the exit open, and the criminal had come in through the door. I wondered what could have happened to my son if I'd been less observant, and the horror had left me so numb that I only wanted to leave with David in peace.